Welcome to Revolution Chronicles. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a story from America's hidden past. Now, let's step back into history, where silence turned into wrath, and one man named Solomon buried his masters alive. The Old South in the early 1800s was a place where beauty and cruelty lived side by side. The plantations stretched wide across the Carolina soil, the fields rich with cotton and rice, the rivers alive with trade and wealth. But behind that beauty, behind the fine houses and polished silver and the laughter of Charleston's elite, there was a shadow that hung. Over every brick laid and every stalk of cotton picked the shadow of slavery men. Women and children chained, not just by iron, but by law, stripped of their freedom, stripped of their names, stripped of the very breath of dignity that makes a person whole among those bound in chains was a man named Solomon. He was not born free. He was born into bondage. His first cry in this world was muffled by the cries of others around him, mothers who had lost their children to the auction block, fathers broken by whips, backs bent beneath the sun. From the first day of his life, Solomon knew nothing but the yoke of slavery, but even in those early years there was something about him, something quiet and strong. His eyes carried a weight older than his years. His silence was not the silence of fear, but the silence of thought. The masters who owned him never saw it, not really to them. He was just another piece of property, another back to bend, another hand to work in. The rice fields and cotton rose, but among the enslaved Solomon's presence was different. They watched him as he grew into a man tall with shoulders hardened by labor, his body scarred by lashes, but his spirit never bowed. There was a fire in him, a fire that did not show in anger or loud defiance, but in a patience that burned low and steady, waiting for the right moment. Charleston was a city built on contradictions. At the waterfront, the markets boomed with merchants calling out prices while ships unloaded goods from faraway lands, but at the same docks the chains rattled as men, women, and children were herded like cattle sold on the very stones polished by their tears. The city's churches rang with bells on Sundays, calling the wealthy to worship. Even as they prayed over pews carved by enslaved hands, the masters spoke of Christian duty. But their fields were watered with blood. The people of Charleston knew, and yet they looked away. Men did not look away. He saw it all and carried it inside every time he bent to pick cotton, every time he carried heavy buckets from the fields. Every time he was struck with a whip for the smallest mistake, he carried it inside where it smoldered like hot coal, though he did not show it the way others sometimes did. Those who shouted or ran off, paid with their lives, hung from trees, or beaten until there was nothing left of them. Solomon chose to wait. The masters he served were not kind, though kindness was rare in such a system. There were 9 men, in particular men, who fancied themselves powerful, each owning a share of land, and slaves, men who gathered in parlors with glasses of whiskey, boasting about harvests and profits. Solomon knew each of their faces too well. He knew their cruelty, not just from his own suffering, but from the screams of others. He had watched men whipped until their backs opened like torn cloth, women dragged into dark rooms, never to emerge the same, children sold away for profit. He knew the names of the masters. He carried them like stones in his chest. He had been forced to build their houses, forced to plow their fields, forced to endure their laughter as they mocked the broken souls under their control. But Solomon's silence was his weapon. Every insult, every lash, every indignity was a log thrown onto the fire within him. And though the masters thought they had broken him, thought that he was nothing but a tool in their hands, he was planning, watching, and waiting. The enslaved whispered of rebellion. But rebellion was death. They had seen it before in small uprisings that ended in rivers of blood. The masters made sure of that. They crushed resistance, swiftly hanging men in town squares, leaving bodies as warnings. They thought fear would keep every slave bent in submission. But fear had limits. Men and women could only carry so much pain before it turned into something else, something dangerous. Solomon was the embodiment of that change. World outside. Charleston was shifting whispers of abolition carried on the wind, stories of uprisings in other lands like Haiti, where the enslaved had risen and thrown off their chains. Some said Solomon had heard those stories in the hush of night around the slave quarters, spoken in low tones as the flames of small fires flickered. Maybe he had, and maybe he hadn't, but what he carried in his heart needed no outside spark. His revenge was his alone. Mo knows the exact day when Solomon began to set his plan in motion. Perhaps it was after another whipping left blood running down his back. Perhaps it was after he saw a young boy torn from his mother's arms. Or perhaps it was a quiet morning when he looked at the fields stretching wide under the Charleston sun and realized he would die a slave. If he did not act, whatever the moment was, something in him hardened. Like iron, that day he decided there would be no more waiting. 9 men who thought themselves untouchable would learn what it meant to live in fear for the first time. Solomon began to watch them more closely. He studied their movements, their habits, their weaknesses. He listened when they spoke drunk in their fine parlors, when they boasted about their land, their horses, their wealth. He watched the way they trusted him too much, believing his silence meant loyalty. They had no idea the storm brewing behind his steady eyes. The land itself was his ally. Solomon knew every path through the fields, every hidden hollow, every stretch of swamp where the water lay dark and still. He knew the soil better than the men who claimed to own it. He had dug it, plowed it, planted it, and buried in that soil was not just seed, but knowledge. He knew where the ground was soft enough to take a body. He knew how to work in silence, how to dig without leaving a trace, and in that knowledge lay the roots of his revenge. The first time he acted, it was small, a test of his courage and his skill. He led one of the masters out under the pretense of work, a task in the fields, something routine. The master came without suspicion, carrying his arrogance like a cloak. Solomon guided him to the place he had chosen, where the ground was loose, where no one came often, and when the moment was right, he struck. It was not easy. The man fought, but Solomon was stronger, hardened by years of labor, fueled by years of rage. And when it was done, he covered the ground carefully, tamping it down with the same hands that had planted rows of crops. He walked away silent, his heart pounding, but his face calm. No one suspected anything. Slaves went missing all the time, sometimes sold, sometimes dead. It was easy to lose track of lives that were never valued, but Solomon had tasted vengeance, and once the taste was on his tongue, there was no turning back. One by one, he would draw them in, and the earth itself would become his ally, swallowing his enemies whole. Each act made him bolder. Each act carried more risk, yet he carried them out with the patience of a man who had lived too long in silence. The masters trusted him more than most, perhaps because they had broken so many others. They thought Solomon was different. They thought he had no fight left in him. That belief was their downfall, for in their arrogance they walked willingly into the fate he had prepared. And so it began, the slow, steady unraveling of 9 men who had ruled with cruelty and believed themselves untouchable. Solomon's wrath was quiet. It did not roar like fire. It did not strike in a single night. It crept like roots through the soil, patient, inevitable, and before long Charleston would whisper of a story too terrible to ignore, a story of a slave who buried his masters alive, a story that would haunt the very heart of the South for generations to come. The disappearance of the first master stirred no alarm. Not at first. The world of Charleston was one where men of wealth came and went, where plantation owners traveled between estates or into the city, sometimes without a word. It was common for a man to vanish into his own vices for days, some set to gamble, some to drink, some to chase after things better left unspoken. When the first man did not return, there were whispers, but no search, no suspicion. His absence was brushed away with excuses and brandy, but Solomon knew the truth, for he had placed the man in the earth with his own hands, and that secret sat in his chest like a hot stone, heavy and burning. The soil did not betray him. the land covered what had happened with the same silence that had long covered the cries of the enslaved. No dogs sniffed at the earth. No riders came searching. The world continued on as if nothing had changed, and in that silence, Solomon found his answer. He could do it again. He could bury not just one, but all who had tormented him, all who had laughed while his people suffered. He would not need fire or blade or gunpowder. He would use the very land that had enslaved him to swallow his masters whole. The second man fell just as the first had, but this time there was a change. The air around the plantations grew uneasy. The other masters began to murmur when two men of wealth were gone in such close time it could not be ignored. Questions began to ripple through Charleston. Had they been attacked by bandits? Had they been struck down by illness? Had they fled debts? No one thought of Solomon, not yet, not even when he guided another into the earth as easily as a farmer plants seed. He moved with care, with patience, never hurrying, never leaving a sign for the enslaved who worked alongside him. There were whispers too. They saw the calm in his eyes, and some wondered if he knew more than he let on, but they said nothing. Fear kept their lips sealed, fear of the lash, fear of the noose, but also fear of Solomon himself, for in the way he carried himself there was something otherworldly, a strength that did not bend to the masters, a silence that seemed heavy with power. Some began to believe he was chosen, touched by something greater than man himself, perhaps by God, perhaps by spirits that roamed the dark swamps of Carolina. Third man to vanish sent ripples through Charleston society. This was no longer chance, no longer vice or travel. This was something else, something that made even the proudest masters sit uneasily in their parlors. They began to carry pistols. They began to lock their doors at night. They whispered in corners about enemies they could not see. Still none of them suspected the tall, silent man who served them. Delinon looked into his steady eyes and saw the storm that raged within. To them, he was invisible property, not person, but Solomon was not invisible. He was a shadow moving with purpose, each disappearance drawing him closer to the vengeance that had burned in him for years. The nights were long and dangerous. His work had to be perfect. No soil could look freshly turned. No sign of struggle could remain. He labored as he always had, hands deep in the earth, sweat on his brow. But now his labor was for something greater than harvest. Now it was for justice, twisted and dark, but justice as he understood it. By the time the fourth master was swallowed by the ground, panic had settled like a fog. Charleston was alive with rumor. Men who had once laughed and boasted now trembled. They accused one another of treachery. Some claimed a rival plantation owner must be behind it. Others blamed runaway slaves hiding in swamps ready to strike. Some even spoke of curses of dark spirits punishing them for sins unrepented. No one dared say aloud what some began to fear, that the land itself was turning against them. Through it all Solomon remained silent, his face the same, his labor unchanged, though inside his heart beat heavy with the weight of what he had done and what was still to come. Each burial was both a release and a burden. He felt the power of vengeance, but also its cost. For the earth does not take without leaving scars on the soul. Yet he pressed on, for he had come too far to stop. The fire inside him could not be put out, not until all 9 had been taken. The fifth man fought harder than the others, stronger, younger, his fists heavy with desperation when Solomon struck. But the years of toil had made Solomon stronger. Still, he bore the blows with the endurance of a man forged in suffering. And when it was done, the earth closed again over another master. The soil tamped firm, the night still, but in Solomon's chest there was no triumph, only the pounding of his slash. We left thee, long to pounding of his heart and the weight of blood upon his spirit. Charleston could no longer ignore the truth. 5 men gone, all tied by the same thread of wealth and cruelty. The city's elite began to whisper of revolt. They feared the enslaved, who moved silently in their fields and kitchens. They feared shadows at night. They feared their own mortality. For the first time in their lives, the masters felt what their slaves had always felt: fear, constant and sharp, the taste of death close at hand. The sixth master vanished in broad daylight. Solomon had grown bold, perhaps too bold, but his silence and patience masked the risk. No one saw, no one dared suspect the quiet man who moved among them like any other laborer. When the man was missed, his household searched. The fields searched the roads, but the land gave up no secret. Solomon's skill with the soil was too great. He buried not just bodies, but the truth itself by. Now the enslaved whispered openly in the quarters, not of rebellion, but of Solomon, of the man who had turned the earth into his weapon. Some called him deliverer, some called him damned, but all knew he was more than what the masters believed he was. Their own silent storm, their unspoken hope that one day the chains would break. Some feared he would bring wrath down upon them all if he were discovered. But others prayed he would not stop until every master felt the weight of the ground. The seventh man to vanish was the cruelest of them all, the one whose whip cut deepest, whose laughter rang loudest as others suffered. His absence was noticed most keenly by those who had long trembled under his hand, for when he was gone, a silence of relief spread through the quarters, a silence that was almost joy. But in the houses of the masters, it was dread. 7 men, now swallowed by shadow, 7 men who had thought themselves untouchable, and still no one knew who to blame by. The 8th disappearance. Charleston was broken. The masters moved in groups, no longer trusting to walk alone. They carried weapons, they hired guards, they watched their slaves with suspicion. But suspicion is not truth, and fear does not reveal the hidden. They were blind to the one who moved in plain sight, the man who bent to their orders in the day and buried them in the earth at night. Solomon's heart was heavy by now, each act pulling him deeper into darkness, but also closer to freedom, for he knew there could be no turning back. He had chosen his path, and it was carved in the soil of Charleston itself. He was both executioner and gravedigger, his vengeance nearly complete. The 9th and final master was not an easy target. The man was cautious, shaken by the fate of his fellows. He did not wander alone. He did not drink too deeply. He watched even. Solomon, with wary eyes but arrogance, was a poison too strong to cure. The master still believed himself above the reach of those he enslaved, still believed fear alone would protect him, and it was that arrogance Solomon waited for, watched for, until the night it betrayed him. When the earth closed over the 9th man, Charleston shuddered with horror. 9 men of wealth and power swallowed by silence, their bodies hidden, their fates. Unknown rumors spread like fire. Some said demons had taken them. Some said the enslaved had risen. Some whispered the land itself had grown hungry and exacted payment for centuries of blood. Whatever the truth, no one spoke Solomon's name. Not then, not ever, and yet among the enslaved his name was whispered in awe and fear. Solomon had done what none thought possible. He had turned the masters' own land against them. He had shown them that even in chains, even in silence, a man could strike a blow so deep it would echo through generations. The masters had sought to erase his humanity, to reduce him to property, but in the end it was he who erased them, swallowed, not by history, but by the very ground they had claimed to own. Solomon walked among the living as though nothing had changed, but inside he carried the weight of 9 lives, and the knowledge that vengeance once unleashed can never truly rest. The soil of Charleston held its secret, but Solomon held its memory, and that memory would live long after the last master had vanished. The 9th man was gone, and with him the last of Solomon's targets. The ground had closed over his body as it had over the others, leaving no trace. But in Charleston there was no calm, there was no relief. The city was poisoned by fear like a fever that spread from parlor to parlor, from street to street. No one spoke openly of what they feared, but it hung in the air like smoke. 9 men of wealth, 9 masters who had strutted through the city like lords, now vanished into thin air. The city Leaders called meetings in dim rooms where the air was thick with cigar smoke and whispers. They spoke of curses, of foreign spies, of runaway slaves. Hiding in swamps, ready to rise up and strike, some demanded harsher laws, stricter patrols on the roads and docks. Some cried for blood, any blood to satisfy their dread, but none could answer the simplest question: where had the 9 gone? What hand had carried them into silence? The masters who remained looked at their fields with new eyes. What had once been rows of profit now seemed like graves waiting to open. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound of shovel or hoe a threat. The enslaved felt it, to the tension was sharp as wire. Men and women who had long kept their eyes low now felt the stares of suspicion burn into them. They were watched more closely, beaten more quickly, punished for the smallest mistakes. The masters were desperate men, are dangerous, and yet Solomon walked among them, still silent, still steady, his face giving nothing, his hands working as they always had. He bore their suspicion without faltering. He bowed his head when ordered. He bent his back in the fields. He moved, like any other slave, invisible to the men who feared ghosts, but could not see the flesh and blood of vengeance before them. At night, the quarters whispered. The story grew larger than life. Some said Solomon had called upon spirits from the swamps to aid him. Others said he had bargained with the devil himself to bury the masters alive. Some said he was no man at all, but something more, a shadow born from centuries of pain, who had taken human form to strike at their oppressors. And when his work was done, he would vanish back into the earth. No 2 stories were the same, but all carried the same message. The masters were not untouchable. They could fall, they could be buried, just as they had buried others in chains and misery. For the enslaved, those whispers were dangerous, but they were also a flicker of hope. Men and women who had lived their whole lives believing resistance was death now spoke in low voices of freedom, of the possibility that one man's silence could change the order of things. Children listened, wide-eyed, their faces glowing in firelight. As they heard how Solomon had swallowed 9 men whole, the story took root deeper than fear. Charleston's streets grew restless. Patrols doubled, men armed themselves to the teeth. Churches rang louder with sermons of punishment, and wrath preachers spoke of God's judgment upon the city of sins left unrepented. They thundered from pulpits that the vanishings were divine punishment, a scourge from heaven to remind men that slavery was sin. But even as they preached, most of them returned to homes built on slave labor, their words drowned in the weight of hypocrisy. Still the fear gnawed at them, even in their prayers. The wives of the vanished masters wept in their parlors, their gowns stained with tears, their jewels clutched in trembling hands. They hired searchers to scour the countryside. They offered rewards for any scrap of news, but none came. The swamps remained silent. The fields gave up no secrets. The soil kept its pact with Solomon. Each body swallowed by the land was hidden, as if the earth itself desired vengeance. Among the enslaved, Solomon's own name was spoken carefully. Some feared him. They saw in his silence not just strength, but darkness. They wondered if he had damned his soul by burying men alive. Others honored him as a hero, a man who had carried their pain in silence and answered it with deeds they could only dream of. Many avoided his eyes, unable to face the weight in them, but in the quiet of night, when fear seemed far away, they whispered prayers for his safety. For if the masters ever discovered the truth, his death would be slow and terrible. The city did not sleep. Guards rode through the night, torches burning along the roads. Men fired pistols at shadows. Dogs barked at nothing. The sound of shovels in the fields was enough to turn a master's stomach. No one trusted the land anymore. No one trusted silence, but Solomon trusted silence. It had always been his shield, and now it was his greatest weapon. He spoke little, he moved carefully. His every step measured, but inside his chest the fire burned still. For vengeance is not easily laid to rest, even when the deed is done. He had buried 9 men alive, 9 souls who had lived without mercy and died without dignity. But the chains on his wrists were not broken. The fields still demanded his labor. The whip still cracked in the air. Slavery still wrapped itself around him like iron. The masters who remained, though trembling, still commanded, and Solomon bore it in silence. But deep down he knew the truth. Vengeance had not freed him. Vengeance had only fed the soil. Legend of Solomon grew. Even as he bent in the fields, the enslaved began to tell his story, not as a tale of one man, but as a warning to the masters. They spoke of a shadow that moved through Charleston, a shadow that swallowed cruelty whole. They told it to frighten children into silence, but also to comfort them, to remind them that the masters were not gods, that even the proudest could fall. The story stretched beyond the plantations, carried by whispers on the docks, by sailors in taverns, by travelers on dirt roads, until even men in faraway towns heard of the Charleston slave who buried his masters alive. The masters tried to crush the whispers. They beat slaves who spoke too much. They forbade gatherings. They patrolled the quarters, but they could not stop a story from spreading. It lived in the soil. It lived in the silence of Solomon's eyes. It lived in the fear etched on their own faces. They could not silence what they could not see. Time passed, and still the 9 were not found. Their absence, a wound that would not heal. Charleston moved on, but never fully. The city's pride had been broken, its arrogance shaken. For the first time the masters knew what it meant to look over their shoulders, to feel hunted, to live with dread. They lived in the very fear they had forced upon their slaves every day for centuries, and it aided them like wrought for Solomon. There was no triumph, only the long wait of survival. He rose with the sun, bent to the soil, listened to the crack of the whip, and at night lay down in silence. His secret heavy as stone. He did not boast. He did not seek glory. He had done what he had done because his heart demanded it, because the years of pain could no longer be carried alone. He had given his wrath to the earth, and the earth had taken its heat. Some nights, as he lay in the dark, he wondered if the spirits of those men clawed in the soil beneath him, if their cries rose through the ground into his dreams. He saw their faces, sometimes twisted in fear, gasping for breath. In the dark earth he awoke, drenched in sweat, his hands shaking. Vengeance had given him power, but it had also chained him to memory. He would never be free of the sound of the soil closing over their bodies. But still he rose each morning, still he walked among the living. The quiet giant of Charleston, who carried secrets no man could guess. He knew the world would never tell his story as it was. The masters would never allow it. History would be written by their pens, not his. But history has a way of bending two truth stories, too powerful to be silenced, find their way into the future, carried by whispers, carried by memory, carried by people who refuse to forget. So the story of Solomon began to take root, not in books, not in records, but in the living breath of the enslaved, in the voices of mothers telling children to be strong, in the voices of men praying for deliverance, in the voices of women holding on to hope. The story was passed from one to another until it became legend, until it became part of the fabric of the land itself, a reminder that even in chains, even in silence, there was power. Charleston would never forget. Not truly. The masters tried to bury the truth, but the soil had already claimed its vengeance, and Solomon walked on, carrying both the burden and the legend. The man who had buried 9 men alive, and in doing so carved his name into the hidden history of America. The years after the 9th man vanished were uneasy years. Charleston never regained the same calm it once boasted. The air always carried unease, like a storm that had passed but left its mark. The masters went about their lives, but their laughter was quieter there. Boasting muted behind every smile, lay fear behind every order, lay doubt. They had built their world on the certainty of control, and Solomon had shattered it with silence and soil. But Solomon himself did not live like a hero. He did not walk free. He did not see chains fall from his wrists. He was still bound by the laws of men. The field still demanded his back. The whip still cracked over the rows. The sun still beat down, cruel as ever. Vengeance had not freed him. It had only evened the scale in his own heart. Yet that was enough. He carried no illusions that the world would suddenly change because of him he had taken. What he needed: a measure of justice, a measure of peace for the countless lashes, the countless cries he had heard. He bore the chain still, but the fire inside him was quieted, not extinguished, but softened like coals that glowed without burning him. The Enslaved, the story of Solomon, grew, each retelling shaping it larger than life, some said. He buried the masters alive, screaming for mercy. Some said the ground swallowed them whole at his command. Some even claimed he walked untouched by bullets, that he could not be killed, for he was chosen by God himself. The details changed, but the truth at the heart of the story did not. Solomon had turned fear against those who once wielded it, and in that turning he gave his people a gift, not freedom, not yet, but the belief that freedom was possible. That belief was dangerous to the masters. So they fought it with every tool they had. They tightened their patrols, they passed harsher laws, they forbade gatherings of slaves on Sundays. They silenced preachers who spoke too boldly, but they could not erase the whispers of Solomon for whispers. Have no chains, they slip through cracks, they ride on the wind, they pass from lips to lips, even in the darkest night. Solomon never confessed, never spoke of what he had done. He lived with the weight of it, and he carried it alone. Perhaps he feared what would happen if the truth ever surfaced. Perhaps he believed the silence itself was part of the justice he had dealt. Or perhaps he knew that no man could ever truly understand what drove him unless they had lived his pain. The silence that had protected him all his life became the silence that kept the story alive, a mystery unsolved, a legend untamed. White men of Charleston did not write his name in their records. They avoided it. They buried it like they buried their shame. The official stories spoke only of disappearances, unexplained vanishings, blamed on debts, on disease, on anything but the truth. But the Enslaved carried his name forward. Solomon, the man who buried 9 masters alive. Solomon, the shadow of Charleston. Solomon, the wrath that could not be chained in time. Solomon grew older, his back bent not just from toil, but from years heavy with memory. The fields wore on him, the lash still left its scars, but his eyes remained steady. Men and women looked into them and still saw the fire, though dimmer now and shaded by years. Some said he smiled more in his old age, though his smiles were small and fleeting. Some said he would sit by the fire at night, his gaze lost in the flames, as if he saw the faces of those 9 men rising from the smoke. No one knows what peace he found, if any, or whether the cries of those buried alive followed him into his dreams. When death finally came for Solomon, it came quietly. No gallows, no mob, no revenge from the families of those he had buried. He died as so many slaves died in the quarters, his body worn, his spirit tired. But unlike so many others, his story did not die with him. It lived on, carried by the people who had watched him labor, who had whispered of his deeds, who had seen in his silence the strength of 1,000 chains snapping. The years moved forward, the Civil War came, Charleston burned, the old world of the masters crumbled under the weight of its own cruelty. The chains were broken at last, though not without rivers of blood. But even as freedom came, the story of Solomon remained whispered in the new dawn. Men who had once been bound told their children of him. They told them of the man who had shown that no master, no matter how rich or cruel, was beyond reach. They told them of the earth that had swallowed cruelty whole. They told them to remembering time. The story traveled beyond Charleston. It became part of the folklore of the South, told in low voices, in cabins, in churches, in fields at night. Some called it a ghost story, some called it history, some doubted if it was real at all. But those who had lived near the soil of Charleston, those who had seen the fear in the eyes of the masters, they knew the truth. Solomon had been real. His silence had been real. His wrath had been real. Historians never wrote his name in their grand books of American history. The records of the wealthy erased him as they had erased so many lives. But folklore has its own power. It seeps through cracks. It outlasts the pen of the powerful. It lives where people gather, where memory refuses to die. Solomon's story became a part of that hidden history, that history not told in schools but carried in the blood of those who survived, Devon. Now when the wind moves across the fields of South Carolina, when the soil shifts in the dark, some say you can feel it, the weight of what happened. The wrath of one man who carried centuries of suffering and answered it with silence and earthsome. Say the land itself remembers that it has never given up the bodies that lie hidden within it, 9 men buried in the soil they claim to own, and a man named Solomon, whose story still whispers through the root. Solomon's wrath was not just the act of burying 9 men alive, it was the act of showing a broken people that power could be turned, that silence could be a weapon, that vengeance could come, even in chains. His story is not one of triumph, for he did not walk free, he did not taste the fullness of liberty, but it is a story of defiance, of a man who would not let cruelty stand unpunished, of a man who showed that even in the darkest soil seeds of resistance can take roots. And so as time moves forward, as history marches on, story of Solomon remains a shadow in America's past, a reminder of the cruelty that built Charleston and the wrath that answered it. A reminder that even in bondage, even in silence, a man can strike a blow so deep it echoes through generations. The masters are forgotten, their names lost to time, but Solomon's story endures not because it was written in books, but because it was carved into the earth itself and into the hearts of those who whispered his name, the slave's wrath they called it, and rightly so, for it was not the wrath of one man alone. It was the wrath of a people bound in chains for too long. It was the wrath of every cry that went unheard, every lash that drew blood, every child torn from a mother's arms. It was the wrath of history itself taking shape in the hands of one man, silent, patient, and unbroken, and though his body returned to the soil long ago, his story still rises like smoke, still clings to the night, still reminds us that beneath the beauty of Charleston lies a darkness that cannot be forgotten. In that darkness, one name still whispers: Solomon.